It's good to be back this evening. I want to welcome everyone who are here tonight to worship God. We had a good start to the year this morning as we launched our goals and budget. Let me remind you about the things that you can pick up at the Welcome Center. If you didn't get them this morning, make sure you go back there and get the budget sheet with the crossword on the back related to our goals. This year, we're striving to fit together according to Ephesians chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, to have that kind of organic growth that God desires for His church. Tonight, as we have been doing on all Sunday nights, since we started back on Sunday nights in December, we have been discussing parables of the Old Testament. And tonight's parable comes from 2 Samuel chapter 14. If you'd like to turn over there, we're going to start, as we have been every night, reading from the parable. So let's read from this one, and we'll start reading in verse 4 of 2 Samuel 14. When the woman of Tekoa came to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and paid homage and said, "Save me, O king." And the king said to her, "What is your trouble?" She answered, "Alas, I am a widow. My husband is dead. And your servant had 2 sons, and they quarreled with one another in the field. There was no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole clan has risen against your servant, and they say, 'Give up the man who struck his brother, that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed.' And so they would destroy the heir also. Thus they would quench my coal that is left, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth." We'll get a little more explanation about that parable in just a moment. But I want to share with you a story first about a judge who showed mercy to a young man who was in his court accused of car theft. And the judge said there's no need to keep him in prison before his trial, and he released him on his own recognizance. But then the judge's car was stolen. And a few days later, the young man was back in his courtroom, and the judge was there, this time not as a judge, but as a witness, because as it turns out, the man he released immediately went out and stole the judge's own car. And the reason I tell that story is it says something about the price that has to be paid for showing mercy. When sin is committed, there is a debt, and if the debt isn't paid by the one who committed the sin, it will be paid by someone, because justice demands that. There's a Japanese proverb that reminds us that forgiving the unrepentant is like drawing pictures on the water. The sin, if you forgive the sin, you may gain the sinner's temporary gratitude, but it doesn't last very long. It doesn't make a lasting impression. Sin is a problem because it upsets the balances of righteousness. And the balance has to be restored. There's pain involved. And the pain has to be borne by someone, either the sinner or the people that he wronged. Dietrich Bonhoeffer spoke of this in terms of forgiveness as suffering. Let me share something with you from one of his writings. He says, "My brother's burden which I must bear is not only his outward lot, his natural characteristics and gifts, but quite literally his sin." So he says, I must bear the burden of my brother's sin. He goes on to say, "The only way to bear that sin is by forgiving it in the power of the cross of Christ, in which I now share. Forgiveness is the Christ-like suffering which it is the Christian's duty to bear." You can't just sweep sin under the rug and forget about it. Either the payment will be paid by the one who committed the sin, or it will be paid by the person who showed mercy and forgave the sin. Now that brings us to King David. The last lesson we talked about David's sin with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah, and his sin was forgiven. But do you remember what Nathan told David in verse 10 of 2 Samuel 12? He told David, he said, "The sword will not depart your house." In other words, his life after sin will be different from his life before the sin. There will be consequences to your actions. And we see that sin debt passed along throughout the rest of David's story. In the chapters that follow in 2 Samuel, you'll find trouble in his household just as the prophet predicted. David's sin debt, the payment, the pain, whatever you want to call it, was passed from him to Ammon, his firstborn, the heir apparent. Ammon violated his half-sister, and the payment was passed down to her. Then the pain was transferred from her over to her full brother Absalom, who killed Ammon in vengeance over what had been done to his sister. When that was done, the pain was then passed back to David, who had to deal with his son Absalom, and eventually was rebelled against by Absalom and banished from his own kingdom for a temporary period of time. What I'm saying is, when sin is committed, consequences reverberate among everyone involved, the sinner and the people that he hurts. We ought to think about that. Someone has to hurt. If it's not the guilty, then it's the innocent. This presents a contrast to God, who can reconcile without ignoring justice. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, so let's get into the parable and the text in 2 Samuel chapter 14 and see how it relates to the theme of reconciliation and forgiveness. And the first thing that we find as we look at this parable is the need for reconciliation. Little background here. I've already told you a little bit about what's been going on, but I'll share some more details on the background of this because it's very important to understanding the text. Israel is in an uproar over David's sin with Bathsheba. David's firstborn, Ammon, has violated his half-sister Tamar and then cast her out. And her full brother, Absalom, who loved her very much, took over her care for the rest of her life. She was said for the rest of her life to be, 2 Samuel 13:20 says, a desolate woman in her brother's house. David did nothing. And Absalom also seems to have swept the sin under the rug, telling her to hold her peace and not take it to heart. And it looked as if Ammon was going to go unpunished, and that nothing was going to happen to him, that he wouldn't have to bear the consequences of his sin. But 2 years after this, Absalom kills Ammon, his half-brother, at a sheep-shearing festival. And fleeing his father's wrath, he goes to Geshur, a city north of the Sea of Galilee, far away from Jerusalem, and he remains there for 3 years. That's the situation when we come to 2 Samuel chapter 14. Now here's verse 1. Now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom. Now this isn't a real surprise if you've read 2 Samuel 13, because the verses just preceding this tell us about how David was tearing his garments and mourning for Ammon day after day, but he also longed for Absalom. This is a parent's heart. No matter how much your children hurt you, no matter how wrong they've been, no matter how much they rebel against you and disrespect you, a mother or a father, their heart still goes out to their children. And you know this to be true. If you're a parent, you can understand David here. Absalom had killed one of his own children, but his heart still goes out to Absalom. Now Joab is the one who is knowing this. Joab was David's army commander. How is he involved in all of this? Well, Absalom was a smooth operator, and it may be that he knowing how close Joab was to David, had worked Joab over, had won him over, become friends with him, and convinced him to help him get back in good graces with his father. That's a possibility, but it's very unlikely because Joab was very shrewd, and he was one that knew how dangerous Absalom was. In fact, it's Joab at the end of the Absalom story who actually puts him to death when he finds Absalom hanging by his hair in a tree and drives 3 javelins through his heart against David's wishes. More likely, Joab felt like Absalom was a threat to the kingdom in banishment, and that he was more dangerous as a foe than he was as a friend. And because of his ability to gain popularity and to bring people around him, he thought it best to bring him back into David's good graces so that he could be treated as part of the kingdom and prevent rebellion. That may have been Joab's motive. It seems to be the most likely motive anyway. Anyway, Joab and David are thinking about Absalom. Now, why didn't they just forget about him? Why didn't Joab just stay out of it? Why didn't David just count that as a loss, see the danger, punish Absalom by keeping him away for the rest of his life? The reason is because as human beings, we need relationships, and you can't have relationships without reconciliation. Since the beginning of time, God has noted, Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, it is not good for the man to be alone. We have been made to crave relationships. Proverbs 17:17 says, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. And what that means is everybody needs a friend they can count on. Studies have shown that people who are lonely live shorter lives than people who have friends. Friendship is just good for you. It helps you in the workplace. Another study I read said that 60 to 80% of firings at work happen because of problems with social interaction. In other words, the inability to begin and maintain relationships. Relationships are very important because they give you a sense of value. I've always liked this quote attributed to Robert Louis Stevenson. So long as we are loved by others, I would almost say that we are indispensable, and no man is useless while he has a friend. Just think about all the relationships in the Bible and how helpful they were to those heroes of the faith. Where would Ruth be without Naomi? We've been studying David. Where would David be without his friend Jonathan? Would Paul have been able to do all the missionary work he was able to do without men like Barnabas and Silas and Timothy? You see, friendship is so important. And that makes reconciliation important because relationships always fall on hard times. Even the best of marriages have struggles. Even the best of friends have falling out with one another. And so reconciliation is a part of every healthy relationship. And those who bear grudges and can't forgive are some of the loneliest people in the world. So what we're seeing here at the beginning of the chapter is the need for reconciliation. David feels that he has done the just thing by banishing his son from his kingdom. He was a murderer after all, and he murdered a member of the royal family. But his heart is still going out to him because of this innate human need for reconciliation. So let's look in the second place at the plea for reconciliation. And this is where we get to the parable. The plea was not made by David himself, but by Joab through a wise woman. The beginning of chapter 14 has Joab to send to Tekoa, a city north of Jerusalem, for a woman who was known as wise. She had a reputation. Maybe she was some kind of soothsayer or fortune teller, but I think she was just a very wise woman. And you can see her wisdom throughout the parable and how she tells it to David. She comes to David and she tells this story that I read at the beginning of the chapter. She puts on clothing of a mourner. She goes to David and she says she's a widow that has 2 sons. And her sons got into a quarrel in the field, and one struck the other so that he died. And now her family wants vengeance. They want her other son, the only son she has left, to pay the penalty of death. And she's begging David to intervene on behalf of her son against her family, because if he doesn't and they kill him, she says, they would quench my coal that is left and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth. This was the last male relative in her family line. So the king doesn't know what to say at first. Look at verse 8 and following at the king's response. The king said to the woman, "Go to your house and I will give orders concerning you." And maybe he's just trying to get rid of her. She senses he's not going to give her a straight answer to her question. So in verse 9 she says, "On me be the guilt, my lord the king, and on my father's house let the king and his throne be guiltless." In other words, you're not going to be blamed for this. All of this will come on me. Just save my son. Still, he is vague. He says, verse 10, "If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again." So he says, I will protect you, but he doesn't say anything about the son. So being this wise woman, I think Joab chose very well. She pushes further. Now remember, this is a woman talking to the king of Israel, a very powerful man. And she says, verse 11, "Please let the king invoke the Lord your God, that the avenger of blood kill no more, and my son be not destroyed." He said, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." So she was able to get the promise. Now this is all fiction, right? There is no son. So somehow she has to make the analogy to his situation with Absalom. Because in the parable, David is the one who has banished the son. Absalom is the son. And the woman is actually pleading for David to bring Absalom back. And so in the next few verses, she tries to make the point of comparison. She tells him what she's really there for. Look at verse 13. The woman said, "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again. We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God will not take away life, and he devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast." Now, if you're like me, reading those 2 verses, 13 and 14, it's a little confusing, which I think is appropriate for the context. The language is clumsy because of the awkwardness of the situation. I mean, she's trying to be very careful with her words, being careful not to say anything that would anger David, but at the same time, she needs to get her point across. That what she's really talking about is the way that he has banished Absalom, and she's pleading for him to reconcile with his son, to show mercy. The king suspects Joab's hand in all of this. So he asks her point blank. He says, "Tell me the truth. Is Joab behind this?" And in verse 19, she answers this way, "As surely as you live, my lord, one cannot turn to the right hand or to the left from anything that the Lord the king has said. It was your servant Joab who commanded me. It was he who put all these words in the mouth of your servant." And we learn in the next few verses that Joab was in the room this whole time, which is interesting. You don't read it that way, and then you realize he's standing right there. Now, when she says, "It is as you say," she's really saying 2 things. First of all, she's saying, yes, you are correct. Joab sent me. But she's subtly saying a second thing when she says, how did she put it? One cannot turn to the right hand or to the left hand from anything that the Lord the King has said. What she's also saying is, you have said that it's right to show mercy. Therefore, by your own words, you must bring Absalom home. Now, this is a tactic we are now seeing for the third time in these parables. Let me remind you, in 2 Kings, or rather 1 Kings chapter 20, an unnamed prophet does this with King Ahab in the parable of the escaped prisoner. And he gets Ahab to say it should be life for life, and thus he indicts himself. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, we talked about this last week, Nathan the prophet tells the story of the little ewe lamb that was killed by the rich man and points his finger to David after David says the rich man deserves death. He says, "You are the man." Now again, we see this woman doing the same thing, using a parable to have the one the parable is about pass sentence on himself before he realizes what they're really talking about. I don't think Joab could have chosen a better mouthpiece for this parable than this unnamed wise woman from Tekoa. She was truly wise. I want to back up to something that she said in verse 14. I don't know if you caught this. In the midst of all the clumsy language and the awkwardness, there's a moment of clarity there where she says one of the most beautiful metaphors that I've ever read concerning death in the Bible. We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Now, what does that mean in the context? What it means is, David, you only have a little bit of time to do this. One day, either you or Absalom will die, and after that happens, it's like trying to gather up water that's been spilled on the ground. You won't be able to do it. It's a statement about the brevity and uncertainty of life that all of us need to heed. If there's something that needs to be done, if there's a relationship that needs to be repaired, if reconciliation needs to happen, if there's a sin we need to repent of, we only have a short period of time. We can't afford to procrastinate that. Something needs to be done now, immediately. If anyone knew this, it was David. After his sin with Bathsheba and the confrontation with Nathan, he was told that the infant child conceived with Bathsheba would die. And throughout the child's sickness, he fasted, he prayed, but when the child died, you'll remember he rose up, he washed his face, and he went about his business. And the servants thought his behavior strange, because usually when somebody died in Israel, there was a period of mourning, maybe 30 days of mourning, where they would wear mourner's clothes, as you see the wise woman doing in this chapter, pretending that she had lost her son. But the king, he gets up and he washes his face and he goes about his business. Now, whenever they asked him to explain his behavior, he basically said, no one can do anything about it after the death has occurred. You remember the statement he said, I shall go to him, speaking of the child, but he cannot come to me. If anyone knew the truth of this proverb this woman tells, it was David. After Nathan awakened his conscience and David confessed his sin, he wrote Psalm 32, where in verse 6 he says, let everyone who is godly offer a prayer to you at a time when you may be found. Surely in the rush of great waters they shall not reach him. There is a time in which God may be found, and then after death, that time is over. We only have a short period of time to do what must be done. And then it's over. All the opportunities are gone. If there's something you need to do, something incomplete, a forgiveness withheld, a grudge borne, a friendship broken, a relationship that needs repairing, a sin that needs to be repented, do it now before the water is spilled out on the ground that cannot be gathered up again. This is the woman's plea for reconciliation. She's asking David to bring Absalom home. Now, let's turn in the third place to the price of reconciliation. And we're talking about price, which has to do with money, with payment. I think this is a place to point out the recurrence of a key concept, the concept of an inheritance. This comes up over and over again, very subtly in the text, and I want to show you how the word play is involved and how it comes up, because we may not see what the original readers were able to see due to our culture and our language. So, first of all, in the parable, verse 7, she says the whole clan, she's talking about her family, her extended family, has risen up against your servant herself, and they say, give up the man who struck his brother, that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. She says, and so they would destroy the heir also. Thus they would quench my coal that is left, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth. So she's worried about the inheritance. She used the word heir there. And what she's saying is, if they kill my son, I'm just a woman. Women had no rights in those days. The inheritance that her husband worked so hard all his life to build up would go to the extended family, and possibly their motive for trying to kill this man was not for vengeance, but out of greed, wanting the inheritance that belonged to this woman. So she needed her son to live, not just for love's sake, but for financial reasons, for her livelihood. She was facing destitution, according to the parable, the story she told, which of course we know was fiction. But it's important to see that's the first time the inheritance comes up. And then it comes up again in verse 13. Here's what she says there when she's drawing the analogy between the parable and David's situation. She says, why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? Now, why would the banishment of Absalom be an action taken against the people of Israel? Maybe it's this. Absalom was considered the heir apparent. Absalom was the oldest son of David now that Ammon was dead. He was very popular with the people. You can see this when he comes back home in chapter 15. He wins over the hearts of the people. And she's making the case very subtly that you've banished the heir, which could be potentially divisive for Israel. So again, she's talking about inheritance. And again, you see this in verse 17. Look at what that verse says. This is still the woman talking. Your servant thought, the word of my Lord the king will set me at rest. Pay close attention to that word rest. Some translations have respite. For my Lord the king is like the angel of God to discern good and evil. The Lord your God be with you. Now that doesn't trigger anything in our minds, but there was an idiom that was very common in the Hebrew language, used among the people at the time of David, that goes something like this: rest and inheritance, or respite and inheritance. They would say, well, your relative has died, but at least you have your rest and inheritance. Or you should go home and enjoy your rest and inheritance. So when she says this word, it's a word that's packed full of a lot of meaning, including the idea of an inheritance. And she's subtly saying to David, look, there's an inheritance at stake here. Now that can mean a lot of things, I understand. But included in inheritance, in addition to power, in addition to dynasty and the line of authority, is a payment. A payment. Now that's very interesting. Something of value was at stake. A price was being paid for justice. Absalom's banishment. But was anybody thinking about the price that had to be paid for reconciliation? A price had to be paid for justice. But what about the price for reconciliation? Were Joab and the woman right? Well, I think if you look at the rest of the story, that question is answered. I want you to see something that Clarence McCartney said, and I think this was great as he compared the previous parable, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble getting this thing to work tonight. Here's what he said comparing the parable of 2 Samuel 12 with the parable of 2 Samuel 14. Nathan came to rouse his conscience. Nathan came to rouse the conscience of the king against his feelings. Here the purpose is to rouse the feelings of the king against his conscience. Isn't that true? David's conscience was sleeping after the sin with Bathsheba. And so Nathan came in with a parable to rouse the conscience of the king against his feelings. But here it's the opposite. Nathan's operating all on conscience. It's wrong for Absalom to be brought back in. Absalom committed murder. He wronged me. He wronged the kingdom of Israel. He doesn't deserve to be an heir. He really deserves death. I'm being gracious by letting him live in Geshur and not taking more vengeance against him. And the woman's parable, she was sent there by Joab, was there to rouse the king's feelings against his conscience. Now think about that. Was that the right thing to do? Was it right to ignore justice? Well, David relents and he allows Absalom to return home to Jerusalem. And Absalom remained in Jerusalem 2 years, sequestered from his father. And then he was allowed full access after that. And when that begins, he starts a 3-year campaign to win over the hearts of the men of Israel. He'd stand at the gate and people would come in with complaints against David. And Absalom would say, you know, if I were king, I would hear your case and I would give you what you deserve. He was making empty promises. We see politicians doing this all the time. He was a very shrewd politician. And years later, he led a rebellion that wound up in David being banished temporarily from the city of Jerusalem. Eventually, there was a war. Joab had always been loyal to David. As I said, his motive in this whole thing was probably for David's sake, trying to prevent the very thing that he helped bring about. And Joab, against the king's orders, found Absalom hanging by his hair in an oak tree and killed him, having the opportunity to stop the rebellion in its tracks. And at the end of 2 Samuel 18, you see the consequences paid. They came on David. Because he showed mercy, that payment came down on his head. And in his grief, he cries, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." Do you see what's happened here? He swept sin under the rug. He thought, we don't have to worry about justice. This payment will just disappear in the air. Consequences don't have to be paid for what has been done. And the consequences came back on his own head. Without justice, mercy cannot hold. The Edinburgh Review was one of the most popular periodicals in the 19th century in Great Britain. And it had a motto in Latin which translated reads this way: "The judge is condemned when the guilty is acquitted." What do you think about that? The judge is condemned when the guilty is acquitted. David's mistake, and the mistake of all who sweep sin under the rug, is to ignore the sin debt, to believe that it will just vanish away in the air, that nothing will happen. And it came back on Absalom, on David, on the whole kingdom of Israel. You cannot ignore justice while showing mercy. Now, there's an obvious question. If that's true, then what hope do any of us have? Because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. You've committed sin, and the wages of sin is death. I've committed sin. The wages of sin is death. So does that mean there's no hope for me? There's no way to escape this payment, this suffering that has to be meted out in the name of justice? David showed mercy and ignored justice, but God will not do that. God cannot deny himself. He is always faithful. He is always righteous. But here's the catch. Here's the difference between our story and David's. God sent his only Son to die for us. He chose to bear the sin debt himself so that we could live. And this makes him, in the words of Paul in Romans chapter 3, verse 26, just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. If you look at the parable of the prodigal son, it's almost the same as the story of David and Absalom, except with a happy ending. You have a father who is wronged by his son. His son goes out and commits all kinds of evil, and he's allowed to return home. The father receives him with open arms, but instead of the son dying tragically in a war, rebelling against his father again, and the father grieving and wishing that he was dead, you have a celebration and you have a feast. How is that possible? It's possible because the Father brings the justice on himself. And that's what God did in Jesus Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 19, in Christ God was reconciling the world to himself. Now remember the story we started with about the judge who forgave the young man, let him go, and then the man went out and stole the judge's car? It reminds you of the saying that no good deed goes unpunished, right? It feels like that sometimes. What's really happening is when you show mercy, the debt of sin falls on somebody. Forgiveness is suffering. People say, well, I don't want to forgive him. That's not fair. Exactly. Forgiveness is not fair. But justice has to be paid. And justice will change the heart of the wicked in one of two ways. Now think about this. It'll either change the heart of the wicked at the end of time, when God's final judgment comes down on their heads. And Paul says in Philippians 2, 9 through 11, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Not just the knees and the tongues of the righteous, but every knee and every tongue of every wicked soul and every righteous soul. At Judgment Day, all will recognize who is Lord. Sadly, some will have to do so knowing that they're headed for eternal punishment. And it will be too late for the justice to be transferred anywhere else. But there's another group. A group whose hearts are touched by grace and receive that grace through faith and are transformed. Titus chapter 2, verse 11 says, the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce worldliness and ungodliness and to live self-controlled, upright, godly lives in the present age. Now that group is changed by forgiveness, by reconciliation. Now, justice will change the heart of the wicked, one way or the other. Either at the last day, or if we see God transferring the justice on himself, and we see that grace, it could change our hearts now, before it's too late, before the water is spilled out on the ground and cannot be gathered up again. What's the case with you? Are you in need of reconciliation with God? Is that your plea? And will you let Christ pay the price for reconciliation? Or will you ignore him and allow that price to fall on your own head? The choice is yours. We're going to sing an invitation song. If we can encourage you in any way, Let us do so tonight as we stand together and as we sing.